Do you ever just wake up from a nightmare and it just felt so real? I mean, man, I just dreamt that both A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill were both on bye in the same week. Wait a second. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. Today we're talking about wide receivers that we're going to start and sit in week 10 of fantasy football. And yeah, we got some big name studs on bye this week. We don't have Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown. It's going to be one of those weeks, but luckily, we have a lot of great matchups here this week with some good options to plug into your lineups. But just like we always do in this show, if you're looking for a specific matchup, yes, there are timestamps down below, but I need to talk to you here for just a second. We as a community are doing a great job right now in doing our part to help make a difference in the world. In just over a month since we've started our partnership with Compassion International, we've had 8 children sponsored and taken from extreme poverty, and then just last week, I don't know if you caught our Saturday night live stream or not. If you did, you saw that we raised $4,400 to donate to Compassion International. This is a great cause and we're not stopping anytime soon. We're trying to get 58 kids sponsored by Super Bowl 58. Like I said, we've had 8 children sponsored already, but we still got 50. But you guys know me, you know I'm not some math whiz here. However, I crunched the numbers and I found out if we want to hit our goal of 58 kids by Super Bowl 58, we may need to get more than 1 per week. So starting today, 2 Compassion Kids of the Week. The heart of this community has shown through over the last month or so, and I do not want to miss out on an opportunity to continue to take some of these kids from extreme poverty. So let's go ahead and meet this week's 2 Compassion Kids of the Week. The first one up is gonna be Enzo, and Enzo looks pumped right now. I mean, he's 4 years old, he lives in Brazil, and he's been waiting for a sponsor for 497 days. Secondly, what about little Miracle here? She is 5 years old, currently lives in Ghana, and has been waiting for a sponsor for over 407 days. Is there anyone out there in Headliner Nation that is able to help out one of these 2 children? Let's try to change their life before the holiday season. If this sounds like something that you're willing to do, there is a link down below in the description. It's compassion.com/headliners. Now, when we showed the pictures of the 2 children here this week, they had a child ID. If you go to compassion.com/headliners, you can actually search for that child's ID. Now, maybe you do that and you find out that they're no longer available. They've already been sponsored. That is a good thing. Don't be disappointed because there are thousands of children on that website that need our help. Like I said, I've seen the heart of our community here over the last month or so, and I'm excited to see where it takes us here in the future. So please head over to www.compassion.com/headliners. But thank you so much for giving me a moment to continue to talk about this subject. I know a lot of people click on this for just football, but sometimes there's more things important in life than just football, and that's what we're about here in this community. But now we can talk some football, and we're kicking it off Thursday Night Football with a great matchup. Carolina and Chicago. And for the Panthers, I'm only talking about Adam Thielen. Why is that? Because he's the only one worth a damn in Carolina right now. He has double the targets of the next closest wide receiver, and there's no other wide receiver on the team averaging more than like 2 catches and 30 yards a game. They are way too big play dependent outside of Adam Thielen. The problem is, this is a bottom 5 offense in the NFL, and big plays don't happen very often. So for that reason, it's only Adam Thielen that I'm considering, but I know he's coming off of a bad game. His worst game since week 1. Bryce has had just no time in the pocket to let plays develop down the field. But there is a little bit of a silver lining. One of the reasons that Adam Thielen is finding so much success this year is slot snaps. And if you've been here for many months, you know we talked about slot snaps all offseason. As of right now, Adam Thielen is second in the NFL among all wide receivers in snaps out of the slot. That right there is the saving grace and why he continues to produce. Now he gets a matchup going up against Chicago. They allow 27.9 fantasy points per game, which is right around the league average. DJ Chark and Laviska Shenault are still questionable at the time of this recording as well. Having multiple banged up wide receivers only leads to more potential Adam Thielen. It's not like I'm trying to sugarcoat this Carolina offense, though. As a whole, they absolutely blow. And their offensive line can't keep Bryce upright for longer than like 0.6 seconds. As of right now, I'm just hoping for volume going the way of Adam Thielen and maybe a wide receiver 2 performance here this week. For their opponents on the other side, the Chicago Bears, DJ Moore and Darnell Mooney. And it's not sounding like right now that we're going to be having Justin Fields back under center. So another week, more than likely, of Tyson Bagent. And really what that means is more of an uphill battle for DJ Moore to produce fantasy points. Him and Darnell Mooney basically having a fantasy football wide receiver mid-off on their own team right now. The production of both of these guys is flex play at best. There's just not enough big plays in this offense either. And once they get close to the end zone, somewhere in the red zone, it turns into Cole Kmet territory. Now with the matchup going up against Carolina, they have only 23.3 fantasy points per game. That is 6th fewest in the league. Plus, they could be getting back Khalil Herbert this week, which is only going to take more potential work away from the passing game if they can find more success on the ground. The volume just hasn't been enough to account for the dink and dunk passes down the field. I will say this, in the leagues that I have DJ Moore on my roster, I have a hard time sitting him. He is really one of those high risk, high reward flex plays that I just throw in each and every week and hopes that he pops off and takes me to a victory. Doesn't happen very often with Tyson Bagent as his quarterback though. Which will then take us up to New England for the Patriots and the Colts. And for the Colts, as of right now, we don't even know if we're going to have Josh Downs in week 10 or not. He was not 100% healthy entering week 9, and then he couldn't even finish the game last week, dealing with some sort of a knee injury. So right now, it's Michael Pittman or nothing in Indianapolis. He has had at least 8 receptions now in 3 of the last 4 games played. Touchdowns in 2 of his last 3. He's actually worked his way all the way up to wide receiver 12 overall on the season, averaging 12 fantasy points per contest. He really needs to be in lineups every single week at this point. Now a matchup going up against New England. They allow 30.8 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 7th most in the league, and they've now allowed over 250 yards passing in 4 straight games. They are much easier to throw on than they are to run on. Now, when it comes to injuries here for Indianapolis, we already mentioned Josh Downs, but we also have offensive tackle Braden Smith, who is questionable to play as well. Now, this is nothing against Josh Downs, but until we see him 100% healthy, he's not going back into the lineup. Michael Pittman, on the other hand, is top 10 among all wide receivers in red zone targets, receptions, and yards after the catch. Pittman will once again be inside my top 15 to 20 wide receivers here in week 10. But what about his opponents on the other side of the field in New England? We got Demario Moss and Juju Smith-Schuster. Demario Douglas and Juju Smith-Schuster. Had you read the comment section in last week's wide receiver videos, the way people were talking, you would have thought that Demario Douglas was Calvin Johnson 2.0 up in here. Then he went out and did exactly as we expected. 5 catches for 55 yards. Juju actually had the same amount of targets and 1 more reception than Demario Douglas did. But just like it's been all year long, unless you're into that sub-double-digit life, the New England wide receivers just aren't it. Now they get a matchup going up against Indianapolis. They allow 27.4 fantasy points per game, pretty average on the defensive side of the football. Devontae Parker, at the time of this recording, is still questionable, just like his production over the last 4 years or so of his career. But there's also multiple offensive linemen that are still on the injury report as well. Is Demario Douglas a bad flex play? No. His likelihood of popping off in this offense, though, is just so much lower than so many other wide receivers that are out there and more than likely available to your fantasy team. Now, if I have to start Demario Douglas, I really hope that I play in a full PPR format. I really don't want to risk it in a half PPR. As of right now, in my top 30 rankings, he's probably not going to be inside the top 30 this week. Which will take us out to Baltimore for the Ravens and the Browns and talk about a defensive slugfest, a battle of 2 of the best defenses still in the NFL. Now for Cleveland, there's no wide receiver we really need to talk about outside of Amari Cooper, who's currently wide receiver 23 overall and averaging 11.4 fantasy points per game. He scored 11 plus fantasy points in 5 of the 8 games this season, but one of those games that he didn't was against this Baltimore Ravens team back in week 4. In that game, Dude had 1 catch for 16 yards, but his quarterback wasn't Deshaun Watson. It was DTR that week. Amari Cooper just needs more catchable targets. Do you remember talking about catchable targets this offseason? Well, right now, Amari Cooper has only seen 57% of his targets be actually catchable, and that is horrible. That's almost outside the top 100. And now he gets another matchup going up against Baltimore, who allows only 23.3 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That is 5th fewest in the league. Now we also have wide receivers David Bell and Marquise Goodwin currently questionable to play in this ball game. It's matchups like this that make start-sit decisions absolutely horrible. Production-wise, Amari Cooper should be in your fantasy football lineup. Matchup-wise, he could really struggle and be a super risky start for you this week. When it comes to my rankings that come out later in the week, he's probably going to be a Verge top 25 to 30 guy, but not somebody inside the top 24 as a wide receiver too. But if we go down to Baltimore, I'm not any more excited for these guys either. What we really need is for Baltimore to fall behind for once, so they have to actually throw the ball in a ball game. They have outscored their opponents 106 to 33 over the last 3 weeks of the season. All they've had to do is just run the clock, running the ball left and right on everyone. Zay Flowers has a combined 30 yards receiving over the last 2 weeks. Odell Beckham, he's got a combined 56 yards over the last 2 weeks, and it only goes down from there. Now a matchup going up against Cleveland. They allow 21.1 fantasy points per game, 2nd fewest in the NFL. And in their last meeting, the leading wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens was, yes, Zay Flowers, with 3 catches for only 56 yards. No other wide receiver in that game had more than 8 yards receiving. This could get gross from a wide receiver perspective. For a team that doesn't have to throw the ball very much, it's going to be a huge risk to start any of these wide receivers. Which will then take us out to Cincinnati for the Bengals and the Texans, and I couldn't believe a comment that I saw earlier in the week when somebody said that Nico Collins was such a bust. Bro, do you even fantasy, bro? Because he's not anywhere near a bust. Sure, Tank Dell had himself a huge day. He does that once every 4 or 5 weeks or so. But Nico Collins, as of right now, is the wide receiver 14 overall in fantasy football, averaging 13.1 fantasy points per game, and he's outscored Devontae Adams, and he was drafted 10 rounds after the dude. Yeah, thanks for playing, but he's not a bust at all. For Tank Dell, the biggest issue is volume. He had 11 targets in the entire month of October. Sure, he missed a game, but still, through 3 games, had 11 targets total. Just last week in week 9, he had 11 targets in 1 game. I would love to throw that guy out there each and every week if he was seeing at least 7 targets a week, but that just has not been the case in Houston here for majority of the season. Now they get a matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow 26.5 fantasy points per game. John Mechie, Robert Woods, and Dameon Pierce are all questionable to play at the time of this recording. Now we know that Houston can't run the football and that they're going to have to throw the ball each and every week if they want to have a chance to win. Now when I look at the wide receivers here in Houston, I'm sorry, but Nico Collins is still the safer weekly option. Tank Dell is just going to be one of those high risk, high reward type guys that you throw into your flex play or a wide receiver 3 spot, somebody that you want to gamble on and just hope for a big day. There's just no consistency there from him to want to trust him each and every week as somebody that you can just lock in. So calm down, Tank Dell truthers. I love the kid, but we need to see him get more consistent volume. How about for Cincinnati? And the question here, the only thing that anyone really cares about is the health of Ja'Marr Chase. He came down hard on his back in week 9, never really looked the same the rest of the game, and is now currently labeled as day-to-day. Do they really need Ja'Marr Chase, not 100% healthy, to beat Houston, though? Especially now that T. Higgins is 100% healthy. We know that we always start a healthy Ja'Marr Chase, but if he's not healthy, what do we do with the guy? Regardless, this is a huge bump to T. Higgins. It absolutely has to be. And that really shouldn't be a surprise to a lot of people because I had him ranked higher than anyone else in the fantasy football industry last week, and it worked out just fine. In a matchup now going up against Houston, though, they allow only 22.4 fantasy points per game. That is 3rd fewest in the NFL. My biggest concern here is that Ja'Marr Chase actually plays in this game. And I know that sounds crazy, but I don't want a limited Ja'Marr Chase that can't make it the entire game. They pull halfway through and it absolutely kills your fantasy chances. If anything, I hope he's a full go, full participant by the weekend. If that's the case, sure, we're throwing him in our lineup. But if he's limited at all whatsoever, don't be surprised if you see T. Higgins ranked higher than Ja'Marr Chase in week 10. Which will then take us out to Jacksonville for the Jags and the 49ers. And for San Francisco, coming off the bye week, which couldn't have happened at a better time for them. But not just because their team was struggling, it gave them an extra week to now potentially get back wide receiver Deebo Samuel. And this is a great matchup for the wide receivers of the San Francisco 49ers, especially since they had an extra week to prep for this game. But like we've known for years, Brandon Aiyuk is more of the down-the-field guy here in San Francisco, and you can tell that by his average target distance so far here this year. Right now, he's currently 7th highest in the league at 14.8 yards. That's his average target distance. Well, on the other hand, you look at Deebo, he's a little bit more reliant on yards after the catch. He's not going deeper down the field, and that's what really makes him a little bit more riskier week in and week out, even when he is fully healthy. But now they get a matchup going up against Jacksonville, and it's great. They allow 29.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They are one of the easiest defenses in the NFL to throw the ball against. Now, when you look at the injuries in San Francisco, most of them are going to be on defense. However, we are still waiting on the return of offensive tackle Trent Williams. What does Trent Williams really have to do with either one of these guys? Actually, a lot. He really affects Brandon Aiyuk, and I'll tell you exactly why. We just talked about how Brandon Aiyuk thrives deeper down the field. Well, in order for those routes to develop deeper down the field, Brock Purdy needs more time in the pocket. With Trent Williams there at left tackle, he gets that additional time. Right now, part of the reason we're not seeing a lot of success in San Francisco is Brock just doesn't have enough time in the pocket to let these routes develop. Now, I know he's getting close to a return, but there is no guarantee that it will be here in week 10, so he's definitely somebody to pay attention to. But like I said, the bye came at a perfect time for the San Francisco 49ers, at a time they were struggling. But I trust this offense, I trust this coaching staff, and I expect San Francisco to bounce back here this week. I will still, however, have Brandon Aiyuk slightly higher in my rankings than Deebo Samuel. What about their opponents in Jacksonville? We got Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk, and I'd like to play a little bit of a game here. I want to know what you think down below in the comment section. Rest of season, do we see Calvin Ridley or do we see Calvin Diddley? Because we saw him have one of his best games of the season in the game prior to the bye week. He had 10 targets, 6 catches, 83 yards. It was only his second game all season in which he saw double-digit targets. Christian Kirk has just been the safer option in this offense once again this season. A lot of that has to do with his ability to play out of the slot. Right now, he is 4th highest among all wide receivers in the NFL in slot snaps. He's had at least 10 plus fantasy points in 6 of his last 7 games played. He's averaging 11.3 per contest. And what's really crazy to look at is the target share between Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk really isn't all that different. Kirk only has 2 more targets on the year than Calvin Ridley does. However, Christian Kirk has turned it into 10 more receptions than Ridley, and that is the biggest difference as of right now. Now, with a matchup going up against San Francisco, you'd think, man, this is not where I want to start these guys, right? Wrong. You want to start some wide receivers against San Francisco. Right now, they are allowing 32.2 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That is 6th most in the league, but that's going to happen when your secondary is as banged up as they are in San Francisco. We're still awaiting the return of Zay Jones as well. Do not know if that's going to happen anytime soon. They haven't even ruled out the option of IR yet. But it's not like the San Francisco defense just totally sucks. They are still one of the best run defenses in the NFL, and they just added Chase Young from Washington during the bye week. Jacksonville is going to have to throw the ball to have a chance at winning this game. Christian Kirk is still going to be the slightly safer option, more of a wide receiver 2 option this week, where Calvin Ridley, kind of one of those boomer bust flex plays. But now we'll head up north to Minnesota for the Saints and the Vikings, and we'll kick it off with Chris Olave, because it was great to see him finally connect on a higher percentage of passes with Derek Carr. 75% in week 9, the highest percentage since week 1. The problem is he didn't go very far with them. 6 catches for 46 yards is nothing to write home about. However, he did have his second touchdown of the season. What I find super crazy about this New Orleans offense, though, was Taysom Hill had more targets than Michael Thomas and Rashid Shaheed combined. Now, as of right now, Chris Olave still remains the #1 threat here in this offense, and he leads the team in targets basically every single week. He needs to continue to be in lineups weekly. Now a matchup going up against Minnesota. They allow over 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is good enough for 9th most in the NFL. But when you look a little bit closer at Chris Olave, you also see that he is the leader among all wide receivers in the NFL in deep targets with 22. They are trying like hell to get that deep ball working in New Orleans, and we just haven't seen it yet. Because of that, we still haven't even seen the ceiling of Chris Olave through the first 9 weeks of the season. Now, with Taysom Hill all of a sudden becoming a receiving threat in New Orleans, it really does limit the potential of Michael Thomas. Now, Rashid Shaheed still basically is what he is, right? He's very big play dependent. If he doesn't get the big play, he's not going to help your fantasy team, a la Gabe Davis. But like I just said, Chris Olave continues to be the safest option in this offense. He will be the guy that I put in my lineup weekly still. I know, I want to see that ceiling too. He's running out of time. It needs to happen here pretty quick. Okay, for his opponents in Minnesota, I love that Josh Dobbs came in and already has this job in Minnesota. That really gives Jordan Addison life in this offense. Not to the level of what it was with Kirk Cousins, not at all, but it doesn't completely bury him either. Jordan Addison still led all wide receivers on the team with 7 targets in week 9. He's averaging 13 yards per reception, and with Dobbs, he still has that chance at a weekly touchdown. Especially when you look at the Minnesota roster, there's a lot of banged up pass catchers as of right now. And in a matchup going up against New Orleans, they allow only 25.2 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 11th fewest. If we're really splitting those targets a bunch of different ways, that's going to limit the potential of Jordan Addison. But so far, as of right now, KJ Osborne still in concussion protocol. TJ Hawkinson, he's dealing with a rib injury. He's questionable to play. We know we just lost Cam Akers last week with an Achilles tear. They could definitely utilize Jordan Addison a lot here in week 10. Now, by no means is this some great matchup for Jordan Addison. I don't want to overhype the matchup. If I had to guess, he needs a touchdown in this game to be fantasy viable for your team. If he does not score that touchdown, it could be a long day against this New Orleans Saints defense and turn out to be a little bit risky for your fantasy football team. For that reason, I look at him as more of a top 25 to 30 guy and not much higher. Which will now take us over to Pittsburgh for a matchup between the Packers and the Steelers. We'll talk about Green Bay first before we get into all that drama that is Pittsburgh. But it's not like everything's great in Green Bay, right? What a damn mess this offense is as well. I believe it's time for me to bring back an old nickname and give it to a new player. So congratulations, Christian Watson. You have now overtaken the name of Fantasy Bigfoot because the sightings of you on my fantasy football rosters are rare AF. The guy is either in the blue medical tent or invisible on the field at this point. They can't seem to commit more volume to Romeo Doubs. Only 1 game over his last 4 with at least 5 targets is absolutely insane. Hell, the leading wide receiver last week was Dontavian Wicks with 4 catches for 49 yards, and a lot of people have no idea who the hell he even is. Now they have a matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They allow 32.3 fantasy points per game. That is 5th most in the NFL. We should be excited for matchups like this, but I know it's not a shocker to anyone. Christian Watson is once again on the injury report with a back/chest injury. Questionable to play. Do not know whether he's going to be out there in week 10 or not. Don't even know if it matters or not. I know there's not a lot of people out there that love this passing game of the Green Bay Packers. It's boring and elementary. Romeo Doubs, though, is still the one that I feel best about, just for the touchdown upside alone. He is top 10 among all wide receivers right now in red zone targets and touchdowns, but even he is on the verge of not even making it into my top 30 rankings once again this week. Okay, now let's go to the drama that is Pittsburgh, right? I understand the frustration with George Pickens. I do. I mean, he's pissed off. He's not celebrating with his teams. He's unfriending them on social media. He's just wanting a bigger part of that offense. And I kind of get that to an extent. I'm not all about that diva personality, but He's being underutilized by a crap ton. He has 3 receptions over the last 2 games, and that is absolutely criminal. Now, I'm sure people will go down to the comment section and be like, yeah, well, if he would have gotten his second foot down, he would have had a touchdown. Understood, agreed. But we have said here on this channel all year long, when this guy gets at least 8 targets, he's putting up big numbers. Why are we not getting close to 8 targets in any given week? It's like Diontae Johnson just came back and Pickens pulled a magic man and just disappeared on us. And you can really see that over the last 2 games of the season, right? Diontae Johnson has out-targeted George Pickens 23-10. Now, this matchup going up against Green Bay, it's not going to be a super easy one either. They are way easier to run on than they are to throw on, allowing only 24.9 fantasy points per game. That's 9th fewest in the NFL. This is really going to go one of 2 ways. This is how I see Pittsburgh playing out. Either Kenny Pickett is totally going to ignore everything that's going on and continue to feed Diontae Johnson. Or this is the time that Pittsburgh really takes this opportunity to grease the squeaky wheel that is George Pickens. 9 out of 10 times in the NFL, the squeaky wheel is going to get greased and the wide receiver's going to get fed. It's kind of just what happens in the NFL. Now, with all of that being said, of course, as of right now, Diontae Johnson is still the safer option in this offense. His floor is hovering right around double digits, and that's exactly what you want. But I could definitely see George Pickens getting a couple big play opportunities here in Week 10. He will remain a boom or bust play. There is nothing safe about George Pickens, but do not be surprised if they give him an opportunity at a big touchdown or 2. But now we'll head down to Florida for Tampa Bay and Tennessee. And for Tennessee, I am super pumped that Will Levis will be the starting quarterback here for the remainder of the season. That's great news for DeAndre Hopkins. In his 2 games with Will Levis, he has 17 targets, 8 receptions, 188 yards, and 3 touchdowns, and continues to be who Will Levis looks at the most. Now, sure, a lot of those numbers came in 1 game, but I'm not going to really hold Week 9 too much against him. It was the young kid's very first time in primetime football in a short week on Thursday night. Thursday night games suck. Going forward, this is a good thing for DeAndre Hopkins. Now, I also don't want to overhype the situation, right? I mean, DeAndre Hopkins isn't some top 12 or 15 wide receiver, but he is somewhere in that neighborhood of a top 24 to top 30 guy each and every week, and that just was not the case with Ryan Tannehill under center, but now a matchup going up against Tampa Bay. They allow 35.7 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is second most in the NFL, and they have allowed over 310 yards passing now in 3 of their last 4 games played. We also know that Treylon Burks is still in concussion protocol. CJ Stroud just absolutely annihilated this secondary last week. Can a rookie quarterback do it to them for a second straight week? I don't know if we see anything close to that level, but I do think that DeAndre Hopkins sees enough volume here in a decent matchup to be a low-end wide receiver to a top 24 guy in Week 10. How about in Tampa Bay? We got Mike Evans, we got Chris Godwin. Is Week 9 great for either one of those guys? No, not really. Cade Otton was the guy grabbing all the touchdowns in Week 9 against Houston, but this is a good matchup for the wide receivers in Tampa Bay as well. The big plays continue to be there week in and week out for Mike Evans. Now 10-plus fantasy points in 3 straight games once again. As for Chris Godwin, he remains a little bit more of a dink and dunk chain mover in this offense and really has a limited ceiling, I guess you could say. He hasn't had a game with more than 80 yards receiving since Week 4, but he is on pace for a career high in first downs, right? So he's out there moving them chains. Unfortunately, we don't get points for first downs in fantasy football, so that absolutely sucks. He really is just more of a safety outlet as of right now. In a matchup going up against Tennessee, they allow over 30.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, though. That's 8th most in the NFL. Mike Evans, in my opinion, is still a top wide receiver that needs to be in your fantasy lineup. He's top 20 in the NFL as of right now in fantasy points per target and top 10 in deep targets and touchdowns. He's really that mainstay in your lineup each and every week as a wide receiver 2 or a flex play at worst. Now, as for Godwin, he's a safe floor play guy, right? I don't mind Chris Godwin in weeks that you're dealing with bye weeks or injuries as a flex play fill-in, but we just don't see the ceiling enough to really want to throw him into one of your top 2 wide receiver spots each and every week. Back out to Arizona, though, for the Cardinals and the Falcons, and it looks like we could be getting back Drake London here this week, who missed Week 9 with a groin injury, but we also know that Taylor Heineke is going to be under center and playing quarterback once again for the Atlanta Falcons, and I absolutely love that for Drake London. What I don't love is we still have Arthur Smith as a part of the equation. Now, Drake London is the only wide receiver in Atlanta that's even worth considering as of right now, but just like every other Atlanta weapon, They are criminally underutilized each and every week and ridiculously hard to trust. In a matchup like this, going up against Arizona, you should want to smash start Drake London. They allow over 29.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, especially since we know Mac Hollins, the number 2 wide receiver in Atlanta on the season, is going to be questionable in this game to play as well. I just can't trust this offense to go out in Atlanta and not just run the ball the entire game against one of the worst rushing defenses in all of the NFL. And to Arthur Smith, this could seem like a great opportunity for probably Tyler Algier, right? The matchup is great. London should be in your lineups, but you got to know, due to this coaching staff and this play calling, there ain't nothing safe about starting anyone in Atlanta these days. For Arizona, just like Atlanta, there's only one wide receiver worth mentioning, and it's Marquise Hollywood Brown, and now he gets his quarterback one back in Kyler Murray, and that is a great thing for Hollywood Brown. Don't forget what this duo did to start the 2022 season. When DeAndre Hopkins was not active to start the season, Hollywood Brown was wide receiver 6 overall through the first 5 weeks of the season with a healthy Kyler Murray. They played together in college. It translated perfectly to the NFL game. You have to think that with the limited weapons in Arizona, we're in line for huge volume going the way of Hollywood Brown once again. Kyler is going to look for him. Now, in a matchup like this going up against Atlanta, they allow 25.7 fantasy points per game. Not a bad defense at all. Michael Wilson, though, he's banged up. He's questionable to play. Running back Amari DiMercado questionable to play. 3 members of the offensive line also injured as well. But we're getting super close to a James Conner return. Not like he's going to have much of an offensive line to run behind, but he is getting close. Now, on paper, this isn't the best matchup for Marquise Hollywood Brown. He really doesn't see a whole lot of slot snaps, so he is going to be fighting those top defenders there on the outside. But with Kyler Murray in his first game back and limited weapons in Arizona, I just can't help but want to start Hollywood Brown as a flex play this week for the potential high ceiling and the potential that he sees 10 plus targets. Now we move over to LA for the Chargers and the Lions, which is going to be my Manscaped matchup of the week. Just a reminder, the holiday season is right around the corner. It is already November, and now is the time to get a little bit of that Christmas shopping done. It doesn't matter what type of bathroom products you're looking for, Manscaped has you covered, but be sure to get it at a discount. Be sure to use code word headliners for 20% off and free shipping. But how could this game, a battle between 2 of the best wide receivers in football, not be my Manscaped matchup? Now, did you know that there are only 2 wide receivers in the entire NFL that have scored 10 plus fantasy points in every one of their games this season? It's Stephon Diggs and Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's averaging over 10 targets per game, has over 100 yards receiving now in 5 of his last 6 ball games. He's averaging a career high in receptions per game, yards per game, and yards per reception. There is no other wide receiver on this team even remotely in the same stratosphere. And now he gets a matchup going up against LA, who allows over 32 fantasy points per game. 4th most in the league. Amon-Ra put up huge numbers against the Baltimore defense. Imagine what he could do against the Chargers. Now, there is a chance that David Montgomery could come back this week. Not going to affect Amon-Ra. He's still getting his. He's one of the most consistent wide receivers in football, and a great matchup coming off the bye week. Amon-Ra is going to be pretty high in my rankings here once again. What about Keenan Allen and the Los Angeles Chargers? Now, Keenan was super close to getting on that list with Diggs and Amon-Ra. He's only had 1 game all season long in which he didn't score over 10 fantasy points. He's the current wide receiver 4, averaging over 16.5 fantasy points per game, averaging over 10 targets per game. Plus, Josh Palmer is on IR, and Quentin Johnson has a whole 14 catches on the season. Keenan Allen should have no problem continuing to soak up targets weekly. Now a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow 26.7 fantasy points per game, and they are way easier to throw on than they are to run on. When you have a wide receiver that is top 12 in the league in targets, slot snaps, receptions, receiving yards, yards after the catch, and touchdowns, he should probably be in your lineup weekly. How about a divisional matchup? Giants, Cowboys. Will kick it off in New York because it's going to be super quick. I'm sorry, but there is no way I'm starting a wide receiver on the league's lowest scoring team against one of the best pass defenses in the NFL with Tommy DeVito as the quarterback, especially when all these wide receivers couldn't even produce all year long with better quarterback play. I don't care what they do. I'm not trusting it rest of season. As for Dallas, I will definitely trust CeeDee Lamb going forward on this current hot streak for sure. 3 straight games over 115 yards receiving, 30 targets over his last 2 games, up to wide receiver 5 overall on the season, and averaging over 16 fantasy points per game. He's scored at least 15 fantasy points now in 3 straight ball games, and no team has been able to slow him down. Not to mention, there's no other wide receiver in Dallas even being close to taking away the target share that we're seeing go the way of CeeDee Lamb. Now a matchup going up against the Giants, they allow 28.6 fantasy points per game. Ever since the media came out and said CeeDee Lamb wasn't a true wide receiver 1 in the NFL, and he showed a little bit of frustration, he has been borderline unstoppable. Why are they going to change that now with all the successes they've had? He's still going to be a super high wide receiver 1 for me in week 10. Which will now take us up to Seattle for the Seahawks, and the Washington Commanders will kick it off in Washington, and it took forever, but Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson are finally starting to look how we expected them to look the entire 2023 season. Over their last 3 weeks, Terry McLaurin is averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game, where Jahan Dotson is all the way up to 14.2 fantasy points per contest. Terry right now the current wide receiver 20 overall in fantasy football, but Jahan Dotson is climbing and climbing fast. He is only 20 fantasy points shy of being a top 24 wide receiver overall in fantasy football. And we know that this throwing is going to have to continue in Washington. They're not going to have a choice. This defense was absolutely horrible to begin with, and then they traded away their best 2 pass rushers. Teams are basically scoring at will, and now they get a matchup going up against Seattle, who allows over 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 10th most in the league. Plus, Curtis Samuel is still questionable and may not even play this week. Washington has thrown the ball 42 plus times in 4 of their last 5 games played. If they want to have a chance at winning any ball game, they're going to be playing catch up and having to throw consistently. Both Jahan Dotson and Terry McLaurin probably going to be in my top 30 this week. Along with these 2 guys probably as well, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. What's confusing though in the Seattle offense is why can't we really get any consistency from their top wide receivers? Sure, last week was bad. They went up against Baltimore. That's somewhat to be expected. But DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett haven't been able to get going all year long. They have a combined 1 game all year with over 100 yards receiving. Each of them only has 1 game on the year with over 10 targets. And both of these wide receivers are currently outside the top 30 at the position. And that's just not normal for these guys. Now, sure, Jackson Smith and Jigba and Jake and Bobo out there taking away some of that safe floor and that ceiling, but the usage of these guys is just weird. Now they get a matchup against Washington, and you know what we do with players that are playing against the Washington Commandos. We start them more times than not. Washington allows 34 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 3rd most in the league. It's simple, like I just said. It's matchups like this where the scoring opportunities are just too high that you can't really afford to sit them. Even though this overall offense has been somewhat disappointing in 2023, here in week 10, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and even JSN may all find their way inside my top 40. Which will then take us out to Vegas for the Raiders, and the New York Jets will kick it off in New York. And even though the season has been pretty disappointing for Garrett Wilson, it's kind of hard to not at least put him in as your weekly flex, right? His floor has still been pretty safe. He's had at least 12 targets and 7+ receptions in 4 of his last 5 games played, and he's averaging 11.1 fantasy points per game. What sucks is he just can't score any touchdowns. He hasn't had one since week 2, but I guess when Zach Wilson is your quarterback, that's kind of to be expected, right? Now they get a matchup going up against Las Vegas, and they got that emotional momentum going right now, and especially with this being a home game, you have to expect them to be pretty amped up here. But Las Vegas's defense isn't all that bad. They allow 23.9 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That is 7th fewest in the league. If anything, I see a whole lot of short targets going the way of Garrett Wilson. I expect Max Crosby to be in the backfield and in the lap of Zach Wilson in about a half a second. That's not going to allow anything down the field to develop, which means a whole lot of dump-offs. Now, while I think the running backs see their fair share of those, you have to think that right behind them is going to be Garrett Wilson with 10+ targets once again. Like I said, a flex play at best going forward. Hate that for Garrett Wilson. What about on the other side of the football, though, with Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers? Even though a lot of people don't want to admit it, every week that goes by, it's looking more and more like drafting Davante Adams where you did late first, early second was an absolute mistake. He hasn't finished inside the top 30 at the position now since week 4. This is week 10. He doesn't even have 20 total receptions over his last 5 games combined and no touchdowns since week 3. Now, can you imagine this offseason if I sat here in front of the camera and told you all that through 9 weeks of the season, Jakobi Meyers would have more points than Davante Adams? You probably would have unsubscribed and left, but yet here we are. Meyers has just been the more consistent option. He's had at least 10 fantasy points now in 4 of his last 5 games played, but his volume is way down too. The only reason he scored double-digit points last week was from a rushing touchdown. I don't think we can count on rushing touchdowns weekly from Jakobi Meyers, and now they get a matchup going up against the Jets. They allow only 17.1 fantasy points per game. That is the lowest in the league, and you have to think that Sauce Gardner is going to get his fair share of Davante Adams this week. Now, sure, Davante Adams is one of the best wide receivers in football. That doesn't scare me. What scares me is the quality of targets going his way from rookie quarterback Aiden O'Connell. Just because Davante Adams may be able to get open doesn't mean that AOC is going to be able to find him down the field. There will be nothing safe with either one of these guys rest of season. That I think we can kind of go ahead and live with as of right now. But don't you dare for a second think that they're not going to go out there and try to put up points. This team looks entirely different without Josh McDaniels. It looks like they're having fun, and you better believe those emotions play a part, and do not be surprised if they start taking some deep shots down the field here pretty soon. Now, if you're looking for safety, it's probably still going to be Jakobi Meyers, but how can you really afford to sit Davante Adams? Most people can't, but when my rankings do come out this week, both of these guys are going to be lower than they probably have in quite some time. Which will then take us to the last game of the week, Monday Night Football. The Denver Broncos and Buffalo Bills will kick it off in Denver, fresh off the bye week. But does anything change in Denver? We really haven't seen much of anything from Jerry Jeudy most of the season, and Sutton, despite being the guy in this offense, still has sporadic usage. He only has 1 game all year long with over 10 targets, however, has touchdowns in 6 of the 8 games played this season. Sutton is currently, listen, this is absolutely crazy. Courtland Sutton is currently 46th among wide receivers in targets. However, he's 4th overall in touchdowns. I'm not like Albert Einstein out here, but I know by looking at that maybe I should get the guy more targets because it could only lead to what? Yeah, more touchdowns. It shouldn't be that hard to continue to get this dude the football, at least opportunities. Is he going to bring in every target? No, we already know that, but I'm sure as hell trying more than they have been here the last few weeks. But now they get a matchup going up against Buffalo, and they allow 27.1 fantasy points per game. We also know that wide receiver Brandon Johnson, a guy who started the season fairly hot, he's been placed on the IR and is not available. Now you have to think that Buffalo is going to put some points up here at home against the Denver Broncos, which means Denver's going to have to throw more. We haven't been able to trust Jerry Jeudy all season long, so if I had to choose someone, it's going to be Courtland Sutton. He's the guy I prefer. He'll be the guy inside my top 30. But Buffalo's a little bit more straightforward, right? We kind of know what to do here for the most part. Who would have thought that one of the most consistent wide receivers in the NFL would be a teammate with one of the least consistent wide receivers in the NFL in Gabe Davis? But we already know we start Stefon Diggs each and every week. What do we do with Gabe Davis, though? That's like the biggest question that everyone wants to know each and every week here in Buffalo. And this is why it is so important to not let recency bias affect your fantasy football decisions. I saw so many people in the comment section, man, I should have started Gabe Davis back in week 8. Do you remember that? You remember seeing that? A lot of people felt that way. But do you realize over the last month, the other 3 games aside from week 8, Gabe Davis has a total of 27 yards receiving. That's in 3 games. That's not just 1 game or per game. No, that is 27 yards total over the span of the other 3 games over the last month of the season. Now, Denver allows 27.3 fantasy points per game, and if I'm being completely honest, I prefer Khalil Shakir over Gabe Davis at this point. He just seems to be a little bit safer. The problem is he doesn't have the ceiling of a Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis is going to remain boom or bust each and every week, and he's going to be a headache from a start and sit perspective. But like I always say with him, you either need to commit to him one way or the other. You're going to take the good with the bad and lock him in as your flex, or you're just going to keep him on your bench and only use him when you have to. But when he does pop off, you can't get pissed off about it, right? Because you have to know you're taking that chance every time you put him in your lineup that he could throw up an absolute dud. All right, that's going to do it for my wide receiver start and sit video here for Week 10 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you a little bit of information to help make those lineup decisions a little bit easier, but don't forget the holiday season is right around the corner and we got kids we need to get sponsored. So be sure to hit that link down below, compassion.com/headliners, and then we can all do our part to make the world a better place.